Here's a historical example that might give you a way to understand the relationship between capitalism and this virus. Back in the 13th, 14th, 15th century, we had an already weakened feudalism in Europe. The people back then didn't know how to deal with depleting soil fertility. They put crops in the same place year after year, not realizing that the yield per acre, the yield per person would go down. Inequality between rich lords and a mass of poor serfs grew. And by the time the fleas and rats arrived, people were poorly nourished, badly nourished, not in good shape. And that's why the disease was so terrible. And as historians teach us, when the disease came and wiped out a third of the feudal society, mostly serfs, many of the lords went belly up. They didn't have the villagers to produce that extra delivered to them as rent. Here's the story in a nutshell. A weakened feudalism was vulnerable to a terrifying disease which further weakened the feudalism. Parallel, a weakened capitalism was affected by this pandemic, by the coronavirus. And the suggestion of history is it will weaken the capitalism that was already weak before. But to make this point, I have to show you, which I'm about to do as best I can, how and why capitalism was weak when this virus hit us. Here we go. Number one, corporations, businesses, large, small, medium, have a greater load of debt going into this virus than they had ever had in history. And the reason is because of capitalism. The crash of capitalism right after 2000, the so-called dot-com crash. And then again, the crash in 2008, the so-called subprime mortgage crisis. One of the ways that capitalism dealt with the crashes then was to pump money into the economy and to lower interest rates to virtual zero, as you all know. Therefore, every business did what? Every business that had a problem, a bad investment, a mistaken choice of what to produce, tensions with your workers, a technology that didn't work. You know how they solved their problem? The cheapest way available, which was borrowing money at no cost. The federal government was pumping the money in, charging no interest, so every business loaded up on debt. Reasonable, unreasonable, it didn't matter. There was no system to weed out those who shouldn't have borrowed because they could never pay it back. When the virus hit, corporations were already in trouble. The same is true of individuals' debts for obvious reasons. Corporations were sending jobs abroad, you know that, for decades before the virus hit. The jobs that were left paid less, were less secure, and had fewer benefits. In plain English, it means you didn't have the health program you once had. You didn't have the security, so you were full of anxiety. You solved the problem by borrowing money, which only added to your anxiety as you understood what could happen to you if you didn't pay back your loan. People were distraught. People were saving. They were compensating for bad jobs, bad benefits, bad security by not eating properly, saving money, buying the processed bag of chips rather than eating fresh vegetable. You know the story. Of course, our society was weakened in the face of the coronavirus the way feudalism in Europe had been weakened when the bubonic plague hit. Then we had the same other kind of problem. After the crash of 2008, the government threw trillions at corporations. They were supposed to hire us all back. They didn't. They were supposed to recreate the economy that was successful before. They didn't. You know what they did? They said, we're going to take this money and do the only profitable thing with it, which isn't surprising because they're profit-making companies. So they bought their own stock in the stock market. That boosted the stock market, boosted the salaries of the corporate executives whose salaries were tied to the value of the stock in the market. They did the things that were good for them, not for the rest of us. So the stock market boomed. We did have an inflation with all the extra money, not in the goods and services you and I buy in the store, but in the stock market, which went wild, which made the top 10% of Americans very, very rich And so they could afford and did afford all the good things in life, and everybody else had to make do with less. But that's not making do without consequences. The consequences was to undercut our health, undercut our well-being, undercut our reserves. We became a society living from paycheck to paycheck, more and more, unable to afford the things that can comfort you in life in a safe way, and turning instead to those that comfort you in ways that are not good. For what? For resisting a virus, among other things. The notion that our economy was great before this virus hit is fake. It always was fake. It's the perspective of those who live off the stock market. And even the stock market's boom was fake, because it was all that money thrown in by the government that was supposed to rebuild a healthy economy, but didn't, and went instead to the stock market, bidding up the prices to atmospheric levels that were not sustainable. And how do we know that the stock market boom was unsustainable? Because when the virus arrived, the stock market dropped like a stone, eradicating trillions in wealth. Little final point. The loss of wealth in the last month is many times more than what it would have cost us to prepare for this pandemic, to produce and store all of the materials we needed. Capitalism made disastrous, inefficient choices. We're living with the results.